July 5th, 1962. In cities and villages across Algeria, people filled the streets. Flags were raised, celebrations broke out. That day, Algeria became an independent country. But July 5th was not chosen at random. It marked the end of 132 years of French rule, which began in 1830. To understand why this date matters, and why it still carries meaning today, we have to go back. Not to assign blame, not to judge people living in the present, but to understand how a country was shaped by colonization, resistance, war, and ultimately independence. Long before Algeria became a colony, it was already a crossroads. For thousands of years, the land was inhabited by Amazigh, often called Berbers, the indigenous peoples of North Africa. They lived in coastal cities, mountain regions, and the vast Sahara, forming societies shaped by trade, agriculture, and local governance. Over centuries, Algeria became part of larger Mediterranean worlds. Phoenicians, Romans, and later Arab Muslim empires left their mark, not by erasing what existed, but by adding to it. By the early 16th century, Algeria was integrated into the Ottoman Empire. It was governed as the Regency of Algiers, a semi-autonomous province connected to Istanbul but largely ruled locally. Algiers became a major Mediterranean port, involved in trade, diplomacy, and conflict with European powers. This was not a modern nation-state in today's sense, but it was not an empty land. It had institutions, cities, social hierarchies, and political authority, long before European colonization began. European involvement in Algeria did not begin with France. As early as the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Spain began establishing a presence along the Algerian coast. Following the Reconquista and the expulsion of Muslim rule from Iberia, Spain sought to secure the Western Mediterranean and prevent North African raids on its coastline. In 1505, Spain seized the fortified port of Mers el-Kebir. Oran itself fell to Spain in 1509. For nearly 3 centuries, Oran and Mers el-Kebir remained under Spanish control, interrupted only briefly by local resistance. Spain did not attempt to colonize Algeria as a whole. Its presence was limited to fortified coastal enclaves, military outposts meant to control trade routes and project power, not to govern the interior or reshape Algerian society. By the late 18th century, Spain withdrew from Oran, and the city returned to local and Ottoman control in 1792. France's arrival would be very different. In 1830, France invaded Algiers. Officially, the invasion was triggered by a diplomatic dispute between the French consul and the Ottoman ruler of Algiers, an incident often referred to as the Fly Whisk Affair. Unofficially, France had deeper motivations. The French monarchy was facing political instability at home, and a foreign military campaign offered prestige, distraction, and an opportunity to expand influence in North Africa. What began as a limited military expedition quickly turned into a full-scale conquest. Unlike Spain, France did not limit itself to ports. French forces moved inland, confronting local resistance and dismantling existing power structures. Over the following decades, Algeria was not merely occupied, it was transformed into a settler colony. Land was seized, European settlers were encouraged to migrate, and Algeria was gradually integrated into France itself, not as a protectorate, but as an extension of the French state. After the capture of Algiers in 1830, France did not immediately control Algeria. What followed was decades of military conquest as French forces moved beyond the coast and into the interior of the country. Resistance was widespread. Local leaders, tribal confederations, and religious networks opposed the expansion, most notably under the leadership of Emir Abdelkader in the 1830s and 1840s. The war was long and brutal. Entire regions were subjected to scorched earth tactics, villages were destroyed, and populations were displaced. By the mid-19th century, France had defeated organized resistance and consolidated control over most of northern Algeria. In 1848, Algeria was formally declared part of France. It was divided into 3 departments, Algiers, Oran, and Constantine, and governed as an extension of the French state. But this legal status did not mean equality. Algeria became a settler colony. European migrants, mainly from France, but also from Spain, Italy, and Malta, were encouraged to settle on the land. Large areas of fertile territory were confiscated and redistributed to settlers, often at the expense of local communities. New cities, railways, ports, and farms were built. For the colonial administration, these developments were signs of progress. For much of the Algerian population, they meant dispossession and exclusion. Colonial Algeria was governed by a dual legal system. European settlers were full French citizens. Muslim Algerians, who made up the overwhelming majority, were classified as subjects, not citizens. The Code de l'Indigénat, introduced in the late 19th century, imposed special restrictions, forced labor obligations, and collective punishments on indigenous populations. Political representation was minimal. Access to education, land ownership, and economic opportunity was deeply unequal. Algeria was legally French, but socially divided. French control did not stop at the Mediterranean coast. In the late 19th century, French forces expanded southward into the Sahara. This expansion was driven by strategic concerns, securing trade routes, connecting North African territories, and competing with other European empires in Africa. The Sahara was not empty. Nomadic communities, trade networks, and long-established routes already existed there. Colonial rule disrupted these systems, bringing new borders, military posts, and administrative control to regions that had long operated independently. By the early 20th century, France had firmly established its rule over Algeria. The colony was economically integrated into the French Empire and politically controlled from Paris. For settlers, Algeria was home. For most Algerians, it was a land they lived in but did not fully control. The structures of inequality were now firmly in place, structures that would shape Algerian society well into the 20th century. When the First World War began in 1914, Algeria was firmly under French control. As part of the French Empire, Algeria was drawn directly into the conflict. More than 170,000 Algerians were mobilized into the French army. They fought in Europe, in the trenches of the Western Front in some of the war's deadliest battles. Thousands never returned. For many Algerians, the war created new expectations. They had fought, bled, and died for France. In return, some hoped for political reform, expanded rights, or at least recognition as equals. But when the war ended, colonial structures remained largely unchanged. Algeria was still governed by inequality, and Muslim Algerians were still subjects, not citizens. In the interwar years, limited reforms were introduced. A small number of Algerians were granted political rights, usually under strict conditions that required renouncing Islamic personal status. For most, this was not a real path to equality. At the same time, new political movements began to emerge, nationalist, reformist, and religious, calling for greater autonomy or independence. These demands were largely ignored. The Second World War marked a major turning point for Algeria. In 1940, after the fall of France, Algeria came under the control of the Vichy regime. Discriminatory laws were enforced, and political freedoms were further restricted. In 1942, the war reached Algerian soil directly. Allied forces landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, making Algeria a key strategic base for the Allied campaign. Once again, Algerians were mobilized. Tens of thousands served in the French army, fighting against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Once again, many believed that the defeat of fascism in Europe would lead to justice and reform at home. In May 1945, as Europe celebrated the end of the war, demonstrations took place in several Algerian cities. Protesters called for independence and the fulfillment of wartime promises. In the town of Sétif, violence broke out. French authorities responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of Algerians were killed in what became known as the Sétif and Guelma massacres. The exact number of victims remains disputed, but the event marked a decisive break in relations between Algerians and the colonial state. For many Algerians, this moment changed everything. It became clear that equality within the colonial system was unlikely. Independence, once a distant idea, now seemed unavoidable. By the end of the Second World War, Algeria was no longer politically quiet. A new generation had emerged, shaped by war, sacrifice, and unfulfilled promises. The colonial order still stood, but its legitimacy had been deeply shaken. The road to independence was no longer a question of if, but of when. By the early 1950s, many Algerians no longer believed that meaningful reform was possible within the colonial system. Decades of petitions, political movements, and limited concessions had failed to bring equality or self-rule. A younger generation, shaped by the Second World War and its aftermath, began to argue that independence could only be achieved through armed struggle. In 1954, a group of Algerian nationalists formed the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN. Their objective was clear: the independence of Algeria. On the night of November 1st, 1954, the FLN launched coordinated attacks against military and administrative targets across Algeria. This moment, known as Toussaint Rouge, marked the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. The conflict that followed was not a conventional war. It was fought in cities and villages, in mountains and deserts, among civilians as much as soldiers. The FLN relied on guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and political organization. France responded with massive military deployments, counterinsurgency operations, and strict control of the population. The war was violent and deeply divisive. Bombings, assassinations, and reprisals became part of daily life. The use of torture by French forces and attacks on civilians by the FLN left lasting scars on both societies. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians were killed, and millions were displaced or interned. By the late 1950s, the conflict had also begun to destabilize France itself, triggering political crisis and the collapse of the Fourth Republic. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle returned to power in France. Initially committed to keeping Algeria French, he gradually acknowledged that the war could not be won militarily. Negotiations between France and the FLN led to the signing of the Evian Accords in March 1962. The agreement called for a ceasefire and a referendum on self-determination. On July 1st, 1962, Algerians voted overwhelmingly for independence. 4 days later, on July 5th, Algeria officially became a sovereign nation. For many, it was a moment of celebration and relief. For others, it marked displacement, exile, and uncertainty, as nearly 1 million European settlers left Algeria in the months that followed. Independence ended colonial rule. It did not erase the consequences of 132 years of occupation, nor the trauma of 8 years of war. Algeria emerged as a nation deeply shaped by sacrifice, loss, and a strong sense of sovereignty. The FLN, born as a liberation movement, would go on to dominate Algerian politics for decades, shaping the country's future in ways both unifying and controversial. More than 60 years after independence, the relationship between France and Algeria remains complex and emotionally charged. This is not because of the people living today. Algerians alive now did not choose colonization. French citizens alive now did not make the decisions of 1830 or 1954. This history belongs to the past, but its consequences still shape the present. France and Algeria are deeply connected through language, migration, culture, and history. Millions of people in France have Algerian roots. Economic and diplomatic cooperation exists, but tensions regularly resurface, especially around issues of memory, recognition, and responsibility. Questions about colonial violence, massacres, torture, and historical acknowledgement remain sensitive on both sides. This history is not told to blame French people today, nor is it told to create hatred, conflict, or division. Responsibility lies with the colonial system and those who enforced it, not with ordinary people living generations later. Telling the truth about Algeria is not an attack on France. It is an act of historical honesty. Algeria emerged from colonization and a brutal war, deeply wounded but unbroken. The Algerian people endured dispossession, repression, and violence, and still fought for sovereignty. That resilience remains one of the defining traits of the Algerian nation. The story of Algeria is not just a story of suffering, it is a story of endurance, of a people who refuse to disappear. Today, Algeria, like many nations shaped by conflict, continues to search for a better future. And that hope extends beyond Algeria, to every country that has lived through colonization, war, or deep social trauma. The lesson of Algeria is not one of hate. It is a reminder that no people deserve domination, that no nation should be erased, and that even after immense suffering, a path forward is possible. Telling the truth about Algeria is not about reopening wounds. It is about understanding how they were made, so they are never repeated. This video is not meant to tell you what to think. It's meant to give context and to invite reflection. If you choose to share your thoughts in the comments, please do so with respect. Disagreement is natural, different perspectives are normal. But disagreement does not require personal attacks. That was never the point of this video. The hope is not conflict, but understanding. Today, Algeria and France remain deeply connected, socially, culturally, and historically. In many ways, they depend on each other more than either side may want to admit. For more than a century, they were part of the same political space, and that shared past still shapes the present. The future does not have to be defined by resentment, but it does require honesty. and perhaps, with time, a relationship built not on domination or silence, but on memory, recognition, and mutual respect.